Good? All right. This morning I'm going to start with a reading from not a common source for us. This is an excerpt from Ursula Le Guin's 1974 novel called The Dispossessed, a science fiction novel. So the background for the excerpt here is there's a group of people, they're winding down after this celebration, this party, and there's a small group talking into the late hours, and the main protagonist, his name is Shevik, who brings up this topic of conversation. Shevik says, "Suffering is a misunderstanding. It exists. It's real. I can call it a misunderstanding, but I can't pretend that it doesn't exist or will ever cease to exist. Suffering is the condition on which we live. And when it comes, you know it. You know it as the truth. Of course, it's right to cure diseases, to prevent hunger and injustice, as the social organism does, but no society can change the nature of existence. We can't prevent suffering. This pain and that pain, yes, but not pain. A society can only relieve social suffering, unnecessary suffering. The rest remains, the root, the reality. All of us here are going to know grief. If we live 50 years, we'll have known pain for 50 years. And the conversation continues, and some of the other people at the party are debating this thesis of Shevik's. And after some time goes on, Shevik continues, and he poses a question to the group. He asks, "Have you ever seen anybody die?" Most of them had, in a domicile or on a volunteer hospital duty. All but one had helped at one time or another to bury the dead. And Shevik says, "There was a man when I was in camp in Southeast. It was the first time I saw anything like this. There was some defect in the air car engine. It crashed, lifting off, and caught fire. They got him out, burned all over. He lived about 2 hours. He couldn't have been saved. There was no reason for him to live that long, no justification for those 2 hours. We were waiting for them to fly in anesthetics from the coast. I stayed with him, along with a couple of girls. We'd been there loading the plane. There wasn't a doctor. You couldn't do anything for him except just stay there, be with him. He was in shock, but mostly conscious. He was in terrible pain, mostly from his hands. I don't think he knew the rest of his body was all charred. He felt it mostly in his hands. You couldn't touch him to comfort him. The skin and flesh would come away at your touch, and he'd scream. You couldn't do anything for him. There was no aid to give. Maybe he knew we were there, I don't know. It didn't do him any good. You couldn't do anything for him. Then I saw that you can't do anything for anybody. We can't save each other or ourselves. What have you left then? Isolation and despair. You're denying brotherhood, Shevik," the tall girl cried. No, I'm not. I'm trying to say what I think brotherhood really is. It begins in shared pain. As some of you know, I work as a hospital chaplain, and I've been in some types of similar situations like the one the character Shevik described in the reading. I've witnessed probably hundreds of people die and even more approach the end of life, and even more than that, navigate various types and degrees of illness, injury, and trauma. My privilege and duty as a hospital chaplain is to show up. Show up to sadness, fear, guilt, shame, confusion, grief, pain, and suffering. My job, in a nutshell, is to bear witness and to offer empathy and compassion. Some Buddhist monks reflect on mortality and impermanence by meditating in a graveyard or charnel ground. Actually, I think hospitals are expedient Buddhist practice grounds as one is exposed to all the 8 sufferings, including birth, aging, sickness, and death. But when I tell people the work I do, one of the common reactions I hear is, I could never do that. Before the causes and conditions of my own life led me to become a Buddhist practitioner and monk, I probably would have said the same thing. I could never do that. When I hear that response, I often think that statement maybe comes from a place of fear. Perhaps fear of being close to suffering, or a fear of incompetence or inadequacy. Like it was for me, thinking, I don't know how to do that, or I don't know what to do. So consider this exchange between the late African-American scholar Bell Hooks and Buddhist nun Pema Chodron. Hooks says, "It seems so much of our longing to escape suffering arises from the sense that the closer we are to suffering, the closer we are to death." And Chodron replies in this conversation, "For me, the spiritual path has always been a lesson in how to die. I don't mean just the death at the end of this life, but all the falling apart that happens continually. The fear of death, which is also the fear of insecurity, of not having it all together, seems to be the most fundamental phenomenon we have to work with, because death is an ending, and endings happen all the time. Things are always ending and arising and ending. But we are strangely conditioned to want to experience just the birth part and not the death part." So the impulse or feelings of helplessness and inadequacy are not uncommon, even among healthcare professionals. One survey that I share when I'm teaching in similar topics, one survey of physicians working at the bedside of dying patients found that 94% felt helpless, 89% felt like a failure, and 51% felt lonely. These feelings are not rare or unique. Anxiety, helplessness, and feeling overwhelmed are at the heart of not being able to name suffering. So the last time I offered a Dharma talk here on the topic of suffering was in January of 2013, nearly 10 years ago, and a full year before I started my chaplaincy training and education. So in the past 9 years, I've had a lot of exposure and experience with suffering, both my own and the suffering of others that I've witnessed. So this morning, I'd like to share some of my reflections, what I've learned, and also some wisdom from some of the ancestors and sages from our own tradition, as well as some other luminaries from other spiritual and philosophical traditions that have thought about this topic. And from these voices, and concurring with my own experience, is the insight of not only the ubiquity of suffering, but in fact, the necessity of suffering. The necessity, and by extension, value or benefit of suffering, is not something I hear discussed or acknowledged very often, either amongst chaplains or even in some Buddhist circles. And I think more seldom is the notion of expressing gratitude for suffering. But if you'll be so kind, that's exactly what I'd like to explore a little bit this morning. I do want to preface here, before I go much further, and be clear that I'm not talking about advocating for or even putting suffering up on some kind of pedestal, right? Not to try to create suffering for the sake of it. In fact, our ethical framework, our moral code, motivates and requires us to try to ameliorate and relieve suffering at all times. So I'll try to argue, along with Bodhidharma, Shantideva, the writers of the Avatamsaka Sutra, and others, that in order to relieve suffering, first we need to face and understand suffering. You think about Batman. Batman would not have become Batman had it not been for his fear of bats, right? Batman leaned into what frightened him most and went in that direction. So one of the principles I learned early on in my chaplaincy training was first to respond to suffering, to show up, like I said, to be present and bear witness. And most importantly, to stay, not to retreat or to turn away. As hard or as uncomfortable or intimidating as exposing oneself, to suffering can be, it's imperative not to turn away, both to one's own suffering and to the sufferings of others. Staying present with adversity, difficulty, stress is difficult. Not saying that this is easy. It requires patience. In our Buddhist tradition, Kshanti Paramita, the perfection of tolerance or forbearance, has been a central virtue throughout Buddhist history and practice, and is one of the 10 perfections that the Buddha praised. So one of the helpful practices that was reinforced in my chaplain training and practice was to look back at the etymology, or the original root or meaning of words. And the English word patience, coming from the Latin, literally means the quality of suffering or enduring. That's what patience is. Shantideva, the 8th century Buddhist poet and author of The Way of the Bodhisattva, the Bodhicāryavatara, writes this way about suffering in his chapter on patience. Shantideva says, "Suffering persists with no effort, but only through suffering. But only through suffering is there escape. Therefore, mind, be strong. There is nothing which remains difficult if it is practiced. So through patience with minor discomforts, even major discomforts become bearable. One should become invincible to suffering and overpower discomfort. Not even in suffering should a wise person allow their serene confidence of mind to be disturbed. The virtue of suffering has no rival, since from the shock it causes, ignorance falls away, and there arises compassion." Shantideva writes more about this in the chapter and elsewhere in the text. And from the writing, we can deduce 7 insights regarding the benefits of suffering. 1, that suffering encourages us to renounce samsara. 2, it strengthens against future difficulties. 3, prevents additional suffering of worry and anxiety. 4, removes arrogance. 5, enables development of compassion. 6, helps us to avoid evil. And 7, helps us to rejoice in virtue or to aspire to Buddhahood. Modern science has also found a collection of benefits of pain, actually. Back in 2014, there are some researchers who took a biopsychological approach and argued 9 benefits in 3 kind of broad groups. That 1, pain can facilitate pleasure. It can heighten our sensitivity and our awareness. Can enable self-regulation, help to demonstrate virtue, and also arouse empathy in others, increase relational focus, and increase solidarity. So some things to consider there. With the help of the clinical pastoral education model, where I was learning chaplaincy, my clinical supervisor, myself and my peers at the time could see how we were subtly and unconsciously turning away when we were reacting out of a place of fear or uncertainty or anxiety. So we had to write up reports of our conversations with patients and other people in like a transcript kind of way. So we would go through these case studies and these reports and really dissect them to see what the learner, the student, was doing and how we were responding in these conversations. So turning away from suffering or turning away from being empathetic or compassionate can take many forms. It can look like changing topics in a conversation. It can look like ignoring cues or invitations when somebody wants to share something or talk about something. It can look like attempting to fix the problem for somebody. In my context, oftentimes that was through prayer or reassurances, right? Telling somebody everything will be better, or it's not that bad, or other ways like that, which in effect often dismissed or diminished the person's experience and left them feeling even more isolated or misunderstood. So we can think about the 3 poisons here, right? Ignorance, attachment, and aversion. Averting oneself from suffering, turning away, paradoxically, can in turn create even more suffering. Kafka captures this phenomenon insightfully when he writes, "You can hold yourself back from the sufferings of the world. That is something you are free to do, and it accords with your nature. But perhaps this very holding back is the one suffering you could avoid." Another way to think about what's lost when we turn away is to hear the words of the famed Christian thinker and writer C.S. Lewis when he said, "Try to exclude the possibility of suffering, and you find that you have excluded life itself." Lewis writes elsewhere on suffering. He says, "Aren't all these notes the senseless writings of a man who won't accept the fact that there is nothing we can do with suffering except to suffer it? Who still thinks there is some device, if only he could find it, which will make pain not be pain? It doesn't really matter whether you grip the arms of the dentist chair or let your hands lie in your lap. The drill drills on." One of my anchors in my first semester of chaplaincy training was to envision and invoke Avalokiteshvara, or Kwanseum Bosal, the archetypal Bodhisattva of compassion, often translated as the one who hears the cries of suffering or the cries of the world. But in order to hear the cry of suffering and to assuage that suffering, again, you have to move towards it. For me, before I started studying and practicing the Buddha Dharma, my default reaction, and oftentimes still is, even with years of practice and study, is to ignore, suppress, wallow in, or yield to my own suffering. It's still part of being human and practicing. But not to examine it, to understand it, or even companion it, to host it. In fact, the Buddhist definition of ignorance means not knowing suffering. Its cause, its condition, its origination, its cessation, the practice leading to the cessation of suffering. These are the Four Noble Truths in the Eightfold Path, right? So we can remember that Siddhartha was motivated and propelled onto his spiritual quest because of suffering, stirred by what are known as the four divine messengers: the old man, the sick man, the corpse, and the wandering ascetic. His exposure to suffering was a necessary condition for his awakening. Without suffering, there is no path, because there is no motivation. Thich Nhat Hanh, whose picture we have up here on the altar, put it quite beautifully and poetically when he said, "Most people are afraid of suffering, but suffering is a kind of mud to help the lotus flower of happiness grow. There can be no lotus flower without the mud." And here we are at Muddy Waters End. Right? I could go on quoting Thich Nhat Hanh for the rest of the morning. He's so prolific and has so much wisdom, but instead I'll just recommend, if you want to hear more about how he talks about suffering, he has a little book that came out a few years ago called No Mud, No Lotus: The Art of Transforming Suffering. My own personal journey to the Buddhist path was catalyzed by my personal suffering. Without the suffering I endured, I may not have started practicing and likely would not have ended up with a career in hospital chaplaincy. Viktor Frankl, Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, was in prison for 3 years in 4 different concentration camps before being liberated. He wrote in his autobiography, A Man's Search for Meaning, "If there is a meaning in life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering. Suffering is an ineradicable part of life, even as fate and death. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete." So there's so many perennial stories showcasing this potential, the potential transformative power of suffering. One such beloved story in our tradition is the story of Kisa Gautami and the mustard seed. Maybe some of you have heard the story before. But for anybody unfamiliar with the story, Kisa Gautami was a woman whose first infant son dies suddenly. And she's devastated and can't accept the fact that her son has died. A lot of her own self-worth and identity is tied up in her motherhood. So she wraps her son's body and is wandering around in the village for days, pleading for medicine, showing her neighbor villagers her son's corpse, and just begging. Eventually, a neighbor, having sympathy for her, encourages her to visit the Buddha. as somebody who may be able to help. So the Buddha says he will be able to bring back her son on one condition, that she retrieve a mustard seed from a household where there has never been any death. So hearing that there's this way that her son can come back, she's overjoyed and set on this mission. I'm going to go get this mustard seed. So she starts going to the first house and asks, do you have any mustard seeds? I said, yes, of course. She said, but has anybody ever died here? We'll say, well, yeah, my brother recently died. She goes to the next house and the next house and the next house. And you can see she doesn't find any families or any households where there has never been death. So she comes back to the Buddha and he says, do you have the mustard seed? She says, no. Everywhere I went, everybody has suffered some kind of loss through death. All I want is peace. Now, and she joins the monastic order and goes on to become one of the preeminent early female monastics of the tradition. Her story, Kisa Gautami's story in awakening, is so important that it's captured in verses 114 and 115 of the Dhammapad's Thousands chapter. That says, one day's glimpse of the deathless state is better than 100 years of life without it. One day's glimpse of Dharma is better than 100 years of life without it. So for Kisa Gautami, her own suffering was a necessary impetus to seek peace. One of the insights from Kisa Gautami's story that's most interesting to me is the Buddha's pedagogy in this case. Rather than telling her or offering her a sermon or a lecture, she needed to discover the truth of impermanence for herself experientially, right? And come to that insight herself. As most iterations of the story recount, when Kisa Gautami is led to believe there is a way her son can be resurrected, she's overcome with joy and optimism. But then there's that turning point, right, where she realizes that she can't succeed in her quest in finding this mustard seed on this condition and must have inevitably felt a sense of disappointment and despair before her epiphany. But this, of course, the Buddha already knew would happen. The young 20th century French philosopher Simone Weil said, the highest existential discipline is to make use of the sufferings that chance inflicts upon us. I like to think of Kisa Gautami as the epitome of Weil's thought there. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there's an adage that says, grant that I might have enough suffering to awaken in me the deepest possible compassion and wisdom. So perhaps our habituated pattern may want to reject this idea of welcoming, inviting, or asking for suffering. But this is where the meditative exercise of Tonglen, or sending and receiving, can be extremely helpful. In Tonglen meditation, you visualize taking in suffering or stress or pain, transforming that and sending out happiness, joy, peace, and health. But even more challenging might be to totally change our disposition and our mindset towards suffering and do as Geshe Acharya Sonam Rinchen suggests when he asks us to regard suffering as happiness. He echoes Shantideva's insight about seeing hardships as an adornment or asset, and that each hardship we face will simply increase our courage. The Dalai Lama, also from the Tibetan tradition, discusses the potentiality of shifting one's outlook in his book, The Art of Happiness. The Dalai Lama writes, if your basic outlook is that suffering is negative and must be avoided at all costs, and in some sense a sign of failure, this will add a distinct psychological component of anxiety and intolerance when you encounter difficult circumstances, a feeling of being overwhelmed. On the other hand, if your basic outlook accepts that suffering is a natural part of your existence, this will undoubtedly make you more tolerant towards the adversities of life. I like some of the contemplative and mystic poets. And I use them sometimes when I teach at the hospital. And one that I really like is Rainer Maria Rilke. the lyrical Austrian poet and novelist, frames it in terms of a question when he asks, why do you want to shut out of your life any uneasiness, any misery, any depression? Since after all, you don't know what work these conditions are doing inside you. So it's worth saying again that it's important not to conflate suffering and wisdom. Right? Seeds are popular images in Buddhism. Kisagotami had her search for the elusive mustard seed. And Bodhidharma, the first Chinese ancestor, describes suffering as a type of Buddha seed. And it's clear to distinguish the utility of suffering from wisdom itself. So the following being attributed to the semi-legendary monk, where Bodhidharma is credited here. Every suffering is a Buddha seed, because suffering impels mortals to seek wisdom. But you can only say that suffering gives rise to Buddhahood. You can't say that suffering is Buddhahood. Your body and mind are the field, suffering is the seed, wisdom the sprout, and Buddhahood the grain. Before Bodhidharma, though, there was another contemporary of the Buddha, the Greek tragedy playwright Aeschylus, who's credited with the idea of pathai-mathos, or learning through suffering. Another metaphor or way to think about this is to consider how suffering can be a raft or a vehicle. We use the metaphor of a raft in Buddhism a lot. George Bernard Shaw saw suffering as our supreme conduit to empathy. However, again, it's important to be cognizant that not all suffering serves as a conduit or vehicle. Anne Morrow Lindbergh tempers the argument when she said, I do not believe that sheer suffering teaches. If suffering alone taught, all the world would be wise, since everyone suffers. To suffering must be added mourning, understanding, patience, love, openness, and the willingness to remain vulnerable. So Lindbergh suggests here that suffering by itself is not sufficient for wisdom, or as we've been talking about, for awakening or liberation. There are other ingredients needed. For my development and my practice and my work and elsewhere in life, the Brahma Viharas, or the 4 heavenly abodes of loving kindness, sympathetic joy, compassion, and equanimity have been crucial. In my experience, without those things, immersing myself into worlds of suffering would have probably been nearly impossible to sustain. I think of these heavenly abodes or modes of consciousness like protective armor akin to a firefighter's uniform, or in the hospital, what we call PPE, personal protective equipment. Practicing and strengthening loving kindness, sympathetic joy, compassion, and equanimity enable me to touch suffering, to stay present without burning out, without getting traumatized myself. So without sufficient practices, virtues, and wisdom, suffering can be overwhelmingly destructive. Many hospitals, including my own, uphold compassion as one of its core values. Compassion and patience share the same root meaning, to suffer. For compassion, the original meaning translates to suffer with or suffer together. In the Mahayana Buddhist pantheon, the path of the Bodhisattva is the principal focus. For myself and many other monks and teachers in the Buddhist world, Mahayana tradition, we aspire to follow the Bodhisattva path, or aim towards it, at least. Throughout Mahayana scripture and literature, the Bodhisattva not only has the capacity to tolerate suffering, but goes further and willfully sacrifices themselves and takes on suffering. In our ordination ritual, the incense burning that some of us have is symbolic of the Bodhisattva's self-sacrifice ideal. This moral mandate is peppered throughout the Avatamsaka Sutra, also known as the flower ornament scripture, which is one of the 2 main sutras of our Tego order, along with the Diamond Sutra. In Book 25, entitled 10 Dedications, Bodhisattvas form this thought from the Avatamsaka. I should accept all sufferings for the sake of all sentient beings, and enable them to escape from the abyss of immeasurable woes of birth and death. I should accept all suffering for the sake of all sentient beings in all worlds, in all states of misery, forever and ever, and still always cultivate foundations of goodness for the sake of all beings. Why? I would rather take all the suffering on myself than to allow sentient beings to fall into hell. I should be a hostage in those perilous places, hells, animal realms, the netherworld, as a ransom to rescue all sentient beings in states of woe and enable them to gain liberation. The poetry of the 19th century Japanese Zen monk Ryokan Taigu embodies this ethos too, when he pens and says, "When I see the misery of those in this world, their sadness becomes mine. Oh, that my monk's robe were wide enough to gather up all the suffering people in this floating world. Nothing makes me more happy than the vow to save everyone." So in order to be able to take on suffering, we must expand ourselves. The quality of expansiveness is well captured in the closing story here, parable. So an aging Hindu master grew tired of his apprentice complaining, and so one morning sent him for some salt. When the apprentice returned, the master instructed the unhappy young man to put a handful of salt in a glass of water and to drink it. "How does it taste?" the master asked. "Bitter," spat the apprentice. The master chuckled and then asked the young man to take the same handful of salt and put it in the lake. The two walked in silence to the nearby lake, and once the apprentice swirled his handful of salt in the water, the old man said, "Now drink from the lake." As the water dripped down the young man's chin, the master asked, "How does it taste?" "Fresh," remarked the apprentice. "Do you taste the salt?" asked the master. "No," said the young man. At this, the master sat beside the serious young man who so reminded him of himself and took his hands, offering, "The pain of life is pure salt, no more, no less. The amount of pain in life remains the same, exactly the same. But the amount of bitterness we taste depends on the container we put the pain in. So when you are in pain, the only thing you can do is to enlarge your sense of things. Stop being a glass. Become a lake."